Hi, welcome to the Week 5 Forum. This week we are looking at the relationship between government and the economy, and especially how federalism has structured American capitalism. Americans want to think that there is a clear distinction between political and economic activity, and never the twain shall meet. A close study of economic history dispels that notion. From the start, governments constructed the original marketplaces, protected them, built infrastructure to more easily move goods and services to and from markets. In fact, I would go so far as to claim that the very notion of free markets is a government-inspired invention. Anyone that wants to fight me on that, please feel free. Robertson opens this chapter with a vignette about hydraulic fracturing or fracking. What are the advantages of fracking for energy companies? Who are the economic winners and losers? Look at it, especially as it relates to Oklahoma and Texas and some of the other states where a lot of fracking is taking place. What sorts of political conflicts are likely to emerge as the oil and gas industry relies more and more heavily on slant drilling and on hydraulic fracturing to extract oil? What are some of the environmental issues that fracking may be creating? Related to fracking is the challenge of wastewater disposal. Companies get rid of the waste from fracking by injecting it deep into the Earth's crust, and those companies actually sell, to the well owners sell that access. The problem is that if you inject the wastewater too quickly, what happens? Well, you get earthquakes. That's why. Oklahoma suffered a spike of earthquakes after 2008, right up until the state's Corporation Commission began regulating. And that highlights something important about how federalism structures American capitalism. Who do you think the Corporation Commission listens to? Big oil or homeowners? Well, that's two very important groups of people, right? In the end, the Corporation Commission really didn't want to be put in that position, and prevailed upon the industry to slow down on wastewater injections. But they didn't stop the practice. And the long-term question is whether, deep injections of polluted water into the Earth's crust is going to have unanticipated ecological and environmental impacts. What are some of the things that states do to try and promote a growing and healthy economy? What are some issues that can cause states to engage in a race to the bottom to try and attract large businesses to come to their states? Think about what was going on in New York City, where Amazon was talking about, putting in one of their major distribution centers. Protests reached a point where they just said, okay, we won't do it, right? What are the long-term consequences of deals like the one that former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker made with Foxconn back in 2016? It's a Chinese firm that manufactures parts for Apple products. How much, did the state and the city of Racine pay in lost taxes and incentives to attract that sort of business? And is that a price worth paying? Right? Today, media reports are that Foxconn is not going to employ nearly the number of people that they promised, and the huge tax incentives built into the deal will cost the Wisconsin government, and the city of Racine billions in lost revenue. And when you talk about billions at the state level, that's real money. How does the idea of government as a structuring presence contribute to your understanding of the role governments play in economic performance? Like the story above with Wisconsin's investment in Foxconn, or the failed attempt to get for New York City to get Amazon. Both the federal and state governments try to convert land, labor, and capital into marketable products. That goes a long way towards producing a healthy, thriving economy that provides meaningful employment for American workers. But it can also, if you don't invest wisely, it can create real problems because you can encumber the state or the federal government for that matter. In my PowerPoint presentation, I describe capitalism as red in tooth and claw. The origin of that phrase, as near as I can trace it, is with Tennyson, who characterized nature as red in tooth and claw. An example, my stepson's father-in-law worked in a tool shop west of Tulsa. And after NAFTA was passed, his job was sent to Mexico. And the company he worked for paid him to go down to Mexico and train the people to do his job. That, in a nutshell, is what free trade can create, right? Similarly, one of the holdups between Canada and the Trump administration on the NAFTA renegotiation that's resulted in the soon-to-be ratified USMCA is that the Canadian government was determined to protect Canada's dairy industry. A purely free trade perspective would be to eliminate Canada's production, and the result would be that Canada would very quickly not have a dairy industry. They wouldn't be able to compete. They'd get all their milk from the United States, where state and federal subsidies of the U.S. dairy industry has created an economy of scale that is far beyond the Canadian dairy industry's capacity to compete. What do you think about this? You know, should Canada have a right to protect a politically influential industry from a larger neighbor? Why or why not? These are kind of illustrations of Karl Polanyi's idea of a double movement, right, within this relationship between politics and the economy. On the one hand, governments confront enormous pressure to facilitate free trade and grow the economy. On the other hand, the very success of capitalist growth produces creative destruction, which displaces workers and harms communities, producing enormous pressure for governments to right capitalism's wrongs. We should always remember, you know, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. Public policies can incentivize economic activity or inhibit activity with intrusive behavior. If you go to drive a car in Europe, you'll find that when you go to the pump, the gasoline is 4 to 5 times more expensive than it is here. European countries made a conscious public policy decision to raise the cost of gasoline to create incentives for their citizens to use public transit and to create disincentives for private car ownership. Why do European countries do that? It's got something to do with population density, right? Robertson provides a lot of really good history on how American federalism contributed to two distinct phenomena: the emergence of gigantic corporations and the aggressive prohibition of monopolies. I think Robertson's treatment of both of these developments is interesting and provocative. Robertson notes that political elites in European nations both allowed and in some instances, encouraged the formation of monopolies in the form of cartels. Why did American jurisprudence on economic policy go in such a distinctive direction? One of the last things I want to mention is the rise of the regulatory state, which really picks up legislative steam in the mid-1960s. What were the perceived problems of the mid-1960s that led to the passage of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the creation ultimately in 1973 of the Environmental Protection Agency? Why did so much regulatory policy happen in such a short time frame? How did the rise of the regulatory state impact American electoral politics? One important reason for all that legislation that came about that Robertson doesn't really address is that elections have consequences. In 1964, in the aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson won 61% of the popular vote and 486 electoral college votes. That's a landslide, right? In contrast to Donald Trump's 303, electoral college votes. Democrats won additional seats in the Senate, creating a 68 to 32 filibuster-proof majority. And Democrats won an additional 34 seats in the House, giving them a 295 to 140 advantage, or 67% of the voting seats in the House. Those kind of advantages gave liberals within the Democratic Party in both houses a significant amount of influence. And so long as they could avoid antagonizing the conservative Bourbon Democrats, they could do what they wanted, right? And I would also note, in that period, everyone was an environmentalist. A lot of Republicans felt compelled to vote on some of the environmental protection legislation. You would not see Republicans begin to adopt a principled hostility to regulatory policy until nearly a decade later. And now, of course, they're opposed to everything. All right. So I think there's a lot to discuss in this chapter. For those students who are economic conservatives, don't be afraid to take me on. I don't bite, and I like a good debate. Just remember, I'm not evaluating your ideology. I'm evaluating your analysis of policy and how well you marshal your evidence. All right, let's have a great discussion this week.